So, Darren, first of all, I have to express my gratitude to you for accepting my invitation. And I have some brief note about you that Darrin McMahon is a historian, author, public speaker, and currently a professor of history at Dartmouth College. Trained as a historian of France, his first book, Enemies of the Enlightenment, the French counter-Enlightenment and the Making of Modernity, dealt with the opposition within France to the Enlightenment legacy in 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries. He has also authored Divine Fury, A History of Genius. You have also written a book about happiness, which we are going to talk about. In the introduction to the book on happiness, Alain Badiou notes that all philosophy is a metaphysics of happiness, or it's not worth an hour of trouble, end of quote. You have devoted, Darrin, almost 500 pages on the topic of happiness, which is trying to tell us what we call happiness today has a history. Happiness, a history, turns out to be a delight, a sophisticated, wise, learned, funny, and thoroughly absorbing romp through the cultural and moral history of the West. I should say it is at once so instructive, but also ironic and amusing. So my first question, Darrin, is, why did you pick happiness and its history?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Marty, for having me today. A real pleasure to be able to speak to you and your listeners. Yeah, that's a great question. So I wrote a first book, as you noted, on the counter-Enlightenment, on resistance to the Enlightenment in France, primarily promoted by Catholic intellectuals. It was a book about the origins of conservative thought, kind of religious right-wing thought. And I think it was of interest to about 10 people in the world, maybe a little bit more, but that's what my parents like to say. And so I was kind of looking around for a subject that more people could latch onto. I'm a strong believer that the humanities belongs to humanity, and that we should target our work to some extent, not only to our professional colleagues, but to smart readers who want to learn things. And I was teaching as a postdoctoral student at Columbia University, and Columbia has had on the books since the early part of the 20th century a course that they call Contemporary Civilization, and it's essentially a Western civilization course, although they actually have different tracks that include Asia and the Near East and so forth. But this part of the course I was teaching, the students referred to as Plato to NATO. It begins with the ancient Greeks and goes forward to the present. And while I was teaching that course, it became apparent that happiness was really a central theme and preoccupation in the Western intellectual tradition. As you well know, it's a central theme of preoccupation in almost all religious traditions, and this is something I've written about more since. But it really just seemed to leap off the page. I thought, this would be a great idea for a book. It happened, moreover, in the late 80s and early 90s when, it wasn't quite when the Bobby McFerrin song "Don't Worry, Be Happy" came out, but it was about that moment. The Berlin Wall had fallen. There was this, kind of optimism we now know in retrospect to be rather naive, but an optimism nonetheless. And literally, the perfume company Clinique came out with a perfume called Happy. You could just spray it on, and so a lot of people were interested in thinking about it. I realized at the end of the project that actually a major movement was afoot in psychology, contemporary popular positive psychology that focuses on happiness as well. I wasn't aware of that when I began. I came at it very much as a historian, but by the end of the book, my work was sort of coinciding with the work of a number of important psychologists who were publishing, and so it was fortunate timing in that respect.
Right, great. There are different epochs and periods. Then you have some singular interpretations of happiness in different epochs. The history of idea of happiness has been neatly, as you say, summarized in a series of equations, let's say. You have happiness as luck, as you etymologically even trace it back to Glück and glücklich, happy and happen, for example, bonheur and heureux, let's say, yeah. And happiness as virtue in Aristotle, for example, the classical understanding of happiness. Then we have happiness in terms of like heavenly happiness, which is more medieval concept of happiness. Then we have happiness as pleasure, which is more Enlightenment understanding of happiness. And then we have happiness, probably the modern conception of happiness I mean, as Charles Schutz would put it, as like a warm puppy, or it's just, yeah, I mean,
Right.
I read it in one of the comments
Yeah,
about your book.
fantastic view.
I mean, in olden times, happiness was deemed a transcendent, almost godlike state, attainable only by the few. What is the significance of historicizing happiness, Darrin? And can we briefly focus on these historical shifts or paradigms of happiness, please?
Sure. Well, I think there's a tendency among moderns to just assume that human beings have always wanted happiness and they've always wanted the same thing. That we universalize that notion, and of course, what we take to be happiness today and what we want is in fact very different from what previous societies have wanted. So, happiness stands as a good example of what the motto of the American Historical Association is: everything has a history, and notions of happiness are no exception. So yeah, you did that nicely, summarizing some of the major shifts. I think one can argue that in basically all early societies, there was a concept that happiness is not something that you can control or make for yourself. That happiness, as you say, depends to some degree on luck, on circumstances, on the benevolence of the gods, or not. Um, and that notion is embedded, as you say, in the words for happiness in really every Indo-European language. I'd be curious to hear about the Persian etymology, but in English, as you know, the root for happiness is hap, which is an Old English and Old Norse word that just means luck or fortune, and we still use it in words like happenstance or happens and whatnot. And of course, that the word for happiness in English, like in French, like in German, and the other European languages, come in much later after the advent of Christianity, but they harken back, I think, to an older kind of perennial wisdom that says happiness is something you can't control. To me, that's a notion that makes sense in a world that's baffling, that's unpredictable, that's prone to famine and flood and the rest. And the example that I begin the book with is from Herodotus's The History, which contains this nice little set piece at the beginning about Croesus, the wealthiest man in the world, who thinks he's the happiest man in the world. And if you've read any Greek tragedy, you know what happens next, right? His hubris leads to punishment by the gods. His kingdom is destroyed. His sons are killed, and he finds himself atop a funeral pyre, crying out to the gods, call no man happy until he is dead, which is this refrain in Greek tragedy. And in fact, in Herodotus's history, which of course is a history of the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, he puts that same thought into the mouth of a wise Persian, Artabanus, who utters something similar, that he says that no man has lived so fortunately that he has not wished at one point or another that he was dead. And this would be the most fortunate thing. So it's a view of the world. It's a tragic view of the world, but it's a view of the world that reflects ubiquitous suffering and unpredictability. Maybe the strong and the powerful have a little bit more ability to guard against misfortune, but even they can't prevent plague and adversity. Well, that idea is one that, as I say, I think is widely shared and endures in many societies and into the 20th century in some parts of the world. But it is attacked directly by what the German philosopher Karl Jaspers called in the post-war period the axial age, by which he meant roughly the first millennia before the Common Era, when one sees in the Near East, in Europe, in Asia, the formation of the major wisdom traditions and philosophical traditions that really are with us still, and around which the moral axes of the world continue to turn. So you see in this period the emergence of Buddhism, of classical Judaism, of Zoroastrianism, of a really surprising number of traditions and faiths, not Christianity and Islam, but those are, of course, Abrahamic religions that grow out of Judaism, and in many ways are connected. So what Jaspers noted was that these religions emerge at the same time, and they continue to provide us with a kind of moral compass. He didn't draw a specific attention to happiness, but uh, what I see is this common interest in the notion of happiness in all these axial religions, and essentially what they begin to argue, and this is true in with Taoism or Confucianism in China. It's true of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. Um, they begin to posit that happiness is not simply a matter of chance. They begin to posit that happiness is something that we can shape to some extent, or maybe even control entirely, by virtue of our character, how we live, how we cultivate virtue, and our relationship to the God or gods, some of which, or the divine, some of which may be dependent upon on how we act in this world. And so, despite this wide divergence in beliefs between these various traditions, you get commonalities. Happiness is thought of something that we can control through our character and action. It's a reward, if you will, for good living. And happiness is bound up in all these traditions with a number of virtues that vary, to be sure, from tradition to tradition, but hit on a surprising number of commonalities. So you get in all these traditions the idea that human fellowship or love is critical and crucial to human happiness. You get the idea that being hopeful, not unduly dour and pessimistic, is important for happiness. The ability to forgive is important to happiness. The need to serve others, actually, and to help others. These are truths that are embedded in all the wisdom traditions, as they're embedded in Islam and Christianity. And it turns out, as positive psychologists have told us more recently, that many of these kind of traits are in fact traits that we associate with people who express subjective well-being or happiness. There's wisdom embedded in these wisdom traditions, is the point. That's something that I think that later periods forget to some degree, because there's a reaction against the axial traditions. There's a reaction in the West against Christianity, which in a more extreme form begins to postpone happiness in this life until the next, as you mentioned. In one Christian reading, and of course the Christian tradition, like all religious traditions, is complex and multivalent, but in one tradition, because of this idea of original sin, we're imagined to exist in this life really to suffer. That suffering is inevitable and unavoidable in this life, and that happiness, if it comes at all, will come in the next life as a reward for our pilgrimage here below. So Saint Augustine, one of the great theologians and fathers of the church, says that true happiness is not of this life. And literally, from the outside, it looks like happiness is death, but death in a Christian conception would be eternal life for the chosen. That idea is challenged. It's challenged in various ways within the tradition of Christianity, but from outside as well, beginning in roughly the 17th and 18th centuries, with this broad phenomena that we term now the Enlightenment. And as with all this, I'm reducing complex phenomena here in the discussion to more simplistic terms. But one I think can trace in this period, first of all, a growing belief that the world is not something inscrutable and uncontrollable. That God, if he or she exists, isn't this kind of figure with a long beard that sits on a cloud and casts thunderbolts down on unsuspecting mortals below. It doesn't act haphazardly. This is the great labor of Isaac Newton, is to show this, to demonstrate this, that human beings, through their reason, can understand God's universe and understand and show mathematically that God's universe is a predictable, ordered place. If it's a predictable and ordered place and people can understand it, they can control it, they can cultivate it, they can make it better. And that broad sensibility then goes together with an increasing belief that human beings haven't been put on earth simply to suffer, simply to wait until the next life, that God wants us to be happy, that we are supposed to be happy, that nature intends us to be happy. You see at the same time an apology for the things of this earth, for the pleasures of this earth, an increasing view that pleasure is not sinful. Pleasure is not bad in and of itself. We're supposed to feel pleasure. That's why we flee pain and are drawn to pleasure. So you get an apology for material prosperity, for um, for the pleasures of the body, and so forth. Now, um, I'll wrap this up here, and we can talk about other things. But uh, one does see with certain thinkers, Jeremy Bentham is a good example of this, a kind of reduction of happiness purely to pleasure.
Mm.
Happiness is pleasure pain calculus in Bentham's view, and many other thinkers in the Age of Enlightenment express that belief. But I think there are enough heirs both to the Christian tradition and to these older axial traditions, particularly Greek and Roman philosophy, to understand that virtue isn't something entirely irrelevant to happiness, that how we live and the choices we make in life still matter. Our character formation matters. So they kind of piggyback on that belief, even if the dominant thrust of the Enlightenment philosophy is moving away from that in the direction of a more sensationalist view of life. And I think gradually, since the 18th century, the character piece kind of falls out, and so that one is left in the West. And again, I'm telescoping a couple hundred years of history here, but one is left in the West with this idea, expressed in a Coca-Cola commercial, that have a Coke and a smile, that happiness is simply a function of pleasure pain calculus, and how we can surround ourselves. Well, no one really believes that at the end, right? No one really believes that you can just open a can of soda and be happy, that you can, surround yourself with products. And yet we're left with this idea that happiness is somehow simple, right? That it's not a discipline. Aristotle, back in the ancient days, said that happiness is a life well lived, and that happiness or human flourishing is a discipline to which we have to train, right? That we have to practice the character virtues throughout a whole lifetime. Just if we wanted to be a great pianist or a great golf player or basketball player, we would have to practice. Well, happiness is similar. And I think all the wisdom traditions understand this. That got forgotten somehow. And I think one of the things that's interesting about positive psychology is that in some ways it's recovering that knowledge and kind of coupling it with science, or modern science, and giving us some insights into the kind of behaviors and attitudes that are more optimal for living happily.
I mean, great. So extending your note about happiness as something simple, this recent understanding of happiness as something functional. I have another question, which is like basically starting about religions. I mean, most religions and philosophers suggested that the best way to deal with suffering was to look at it in the eye, prescribing a variety of regimes. Aristotle, for example, advised a life lived in accordance with virtues as the best means to happiness. Jews recommended fidelity to the law, Christians the cultivation of charity, Confucians and Taoists, for their part, taught their followers to live in accordance with the way, and Muslims sought submission to God and his word. But something unusual happened in the 18th century, as you said. The way people talked about happiness started to shift. Whereas happiness had once been seen as a rare and a special achievement in a world of suffering and pain, now there was a growing consensus that many stood a good chance of outwitting suffering once and for all. So my question, one can say that happiness was seen no more as an exception, but as a rule everyone was entitled to pursue. Wasn't it a result of, even a direct result of democratization of happiness?
I think in the long run, absolutely. And indeed, one sees this very clearly in the 18th century. I teach a course at Dartmouth in New Hampshire on happiness. And I love to show to my students midway through the course the 18th century state constitution of New Hampshire, which, like many state constitutions, offers a right not only to pursue happiness, and as you probably know, the Declaration of Independence of the United States talks about a right to pursue happiness, But the state constitution of New Hampshire, like the state constitution of Virginia or Vermont or others, actually guarantees a right to obtain happiness.
Mm.
Literally, people in the 18th century are talking about a right to happiness. And that's indicative of this broader sensibility that, yes, human beings are supposed to be happy.
Mm.
Happiness, as you say, is not an exception. Happiness is or should be the norm. And where human beings are not happy, we can point to problems, either false beliefs on their part that are impeding their ability to pursue happiness freely, or injustice.
Mm.
Uh, and that then needs to be addressed. Now, obviously, if you're a slave in the New World, or a Jew in the shtetl in Europe, or a member of an oppressed person, or a woman in a bad marriage, you don't just wake up automatically in the 18th century and say, oh, I have a right to be happy. And yet one does begin to see already in the 18th century groups positing a right to happiness, even suing, in the case of the United States,
Mm.
state governments for not fulfilling their right to pursue happiness. And then with the spread in the 19th century of socialism, which very explicitly makes appeals, universal appeals to all human beings' right to a happy life, you see the spread of this. And so, yes, I think the democratization of the expectation of human happiness
Mm.
is crucial. And indeed, I term this the a revolution in human expectations that
Mm.
begins in the 18th century and is only spread and indeed globalized since that period. But you say, your mention of death is really interesting in this connection, because I think, yes, with our increasing power to control life and to control suffering, which is of course a good thing, we tricked ourselves into believing that we can out control, that we can out control fate. And COVID is a great reminder that we still
Yeah.
don't have that ability and never will. And indeed, it's actually really interesting that there's psychological data to suggest that cultures that think about death more often are actually happier,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
that's so counterintuitive, at least to many people. But I think it's right, that avoidance is not a good strategy in a lot of things, and it turns out that avoidance of death in a strategy of happiness is not a good way to approach things
Mm.
either.
Yeah, I will go back to this question later. I mean, on the one hand, the book unveils the human attempts to demonstrations of happiness in placing emphasis on happiness here and now because of the technological advances in human life. I quote you, famine and epidemic disease were in decline, which meant that people could worry less about surviving and more about living well, improving living standards combined with a sense of greater control over the environment. Homes were better heated, fields were better tilled, and the streets were better lit. That allowed people to imagine continuing to exert control over the circumstances, bending the world and all the uncertainties and privations to their will, end of quote. Yet, on the other hand, there is an epistemological and even ontological shift where sin has been interpreted differently. It seems that these two factors played into one another and resulted in the Enlightenment view of happiness, where downplayed sin and damnation while praising the human capacity for enjoyment. We were built to be happy in this life. It seemed not just the next, and God wanted it so. To what extent do you think this emancipation from guilt or even sin was successful in making us happy?
Well, I think there's elements of success, surely. That the Enlightenment assertion that um, we don't have to suffer uh, by virtue of human beings. Um, Maybe in the extreme that's exaggerated, but this idea that we don't have to feel guilt for just being alive, I think is liberating. And guilt is pernicious in all kinds of ways. And the Enlightenment opens up, or this new attitude towards human happiness opens up the possibility for experiencing guilt-free pleasure in all kinds of ways, in sexuality, in wealth creation, and so forth, which I think in some ways is to the good. But I do think that actually there's this kind of paradox at play in the 18th century, and it makes sense if you think about it like this. If you tell people that they're supposed to be happy, that happiness is not a rare achievement or a special thing, a stroke of fortune, or the result of divine favor. They're supposed to be happy. That happiness is really our kind of natural state. And then they ask themselves, well, I'm not really so happy.
Mm,
Uh, how do you explain this? And really, there's one of two responses. Either other people have failed you somehow, injustice have prevented you from being happy, or you blame yourself. You blame yourself for not being happy. And I think one begins to see in the 18th century, and I trace this to some degree in Rousseau and others, a new phenomena that is very much a part of our own world. And I call this the unhappiness rather of not being happy.
mm.
We blame ourselves for not pursuing and obtaining our human end. And I think this has only increased in the modern world where, one, we're surrounded with images in media and advertising of happy people enjoying themselves in a guilt-free way all the time. And two, we increasingly tend to associate happiness with success.
Mm.
Uh, that happiness is the product or the association of wealth and status and power, and that in fact might even be true to some extent. But the point being here is that we've moralized happiness. We see it as a marker of human achievement, and so those people who are not happy are kind of doubly damned.
Mm.
Not only are they not happy or not successful, but they suffer. And I think this is a horrible plague of our own time, actually.
I, I mean, Darren, let's go back to the Greek world. Yeah, I mean, and there are very interesting parts in the book, very inspirational parts. I mean, in the Greek world, it seems that it's not by chance that we have a profoundly developed genre like tragedy. But beyond this genre, it seems that we have a worldview. I mean, tragic worldview, a general conception, as you say, of the world in which suffering is endemic and happiness largely beyond our control. Especially as tragedies rarely have happy endings. They are usually replete with characters who are overwhelmed by circumstances they cannot control. Electra, Medea, Agamemnon, they are examples. As in case of Agamemnon, as I quote you, he must either sacrifice his own daughter at the behest of gods or relinquish his honor by abandoning the Greek campaign against Troy. Conflict is inevitable and struggle preordained. Yet all Greek tragedies were followed, and that's my question, by an atmosphere of gaiety, rejoicing, and ecstasy. They're standing, as you say, stasy and outside ek in the word ecstasy of one's normal self. Even the unhappiness of unhappy ending gave way to mirth, as you put it. Then how can we define comedy? After all, we have all Greek comedies. I mean, we have all Greek comedies. And how can we interpret the link between tragic catharsis and comic relief in Greek world?
Right. So catharsis is the crucial poetic concept that Aristotle innovates to describe precisely the phenomena. I'm thinking as you speak of a story. A friend of mine who's now of a certain age, a kind of 60th generation student of India, and he tells the story of working in famine relief in India in the 1960s, and he was boarding a train, and the train had pulled into a station, and it was terribly, terribly crowded. In fact, there were no seats left, and people were just grabbing onto the train. And as it started to pull out of the station, they continued to run and to grab on, and there were so many people that they were hanging from the sides. And my friend was standing there, and a man had tried to leap on, and he grabbed his arm and he helped pull him up, and he was holding on, and the train moved faster and faster and faster, and eventually he couldn't hold on anymore, and he let go, or his hand slipped, and the train was moving quickly at that point, and he fell to his death. And my friend describes an eruption of laughter on the train, and this, I think, was precisely what you're talking about. It wasn't laughter that was malicious. It was laughter at the absurdity of the situation, laughter as a kind of outlet to the horror and tragedy of this poor man who had just died in circumstances that could have engulfed any single one of the people on the train. Right? It was just a bad situation, and laughter was somehow the human response to that. I think laughter is often a response to situations that are discordant that we can't fully understand. But this goes back to this idea that confronting death and tragedy is not necessarily antithetical to happiness or joy. Um, the one way of explaining it, of course, it's cliche, but I think there's truth to it. If you meditate on your finitude, if you meditate on the inevitability of death and suffering, it puts things into perspective. All religious traditions know this, and it does force you or ask you to appreciate what you have. The mirth and ecstasy after tragic spectacle is maybe something more extreme, like relief, a kind of relief that we were lucky this time, I suppose. But clearly, there's this injunction to savor, to appreciate while we can, right? Eat and drink now, for tomorrow we will die. And I think the cultures that live closer to death have lower expectations, but then they appreciate what they have when they have it. This is something that even St. Augustine in the Christian tradition mentions at the end of his big magnum opus, The City of God. He's explained that true happiness is not of this world, that because of sin, we're destined to always want more than we can have, to always be restless and dissatisfied. That's his kind of default understanding of humanity. But then at the end of the book, he has these wonderful passages where he says, look at the beauty of the sunlight on the sea, or the way that trees sway in the wind. And these are incredible blessings, and we're surrounded by them, and we must savor them always, because they're ephemeral.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about laughter, Darrin, one automatically thinks of Nietzsche as one of the rare philosophers who talks about laughter. Yeah.
Precisely,
So, according to you, Hegel explains suffering. I quote you: Hegel explains suffering, describing his narration of history as the recollection of Golgotha and the absolute spirit. End of quote. Or again, as you put it brilliantly, Hegel and his system explain suffering rather than explaining it away. But also for Hegel, this unhappy unconsciousness is only a phase in history. It's a transitional stage and nothing permanent. Although there has always been Entfremdung or the Enttäuschung in history, but he sees an advance in Christianity over earlier periods. But this is quite opposite to Nietzsche. Nietzsche does not, no less than Freud, see any elevation, or as Freud would call it, a sublimation in history progress. Nietzsche's emphasis on humor and laughter, which according to scholar is among the 5 most frequent concepts in Nietzsche's corpus, implies that instead of looking for a systematic happiness, the likes of Nietzsche and his successors in contemporary philosophy like Deleuze has been more looking for an ephemeral happiness embodied in laughter. To me, your book provides an answer to another question which has occupied plenty of philosophers, namely why philosophers and philosophies have written so scarcely about humor. I interpret it this way, that either they were not interested in the question of humor, or maybe they have been busy answering what it means to be happy. After all, humor is an answer to an unhappy world, a world that should be dealt with and be even tolerated.
Yeah, we need more Diogenes.
That was my speech.
I love the question. It was a great speech. I don't know what more to say, other than you said that Freud's term sublimation, and I always like to point out, of course, that's Nietzsche's term that Freud probably took from Nietzsche, although he claims never to have read Nietzsche, even though he owned his collective works. Right. But they're interesting parallels.
Yeah.
I mean, philosophers probably don't laugh enough in general, right? And this is one of Nietzsche's great characteristics. I mean, Nietzsche is interesting on questions of happiness and suffering, to put it mildly. Yeah, I don't know what to say. That was a great speech.
No, I mean, for me, it's interesting because I wrote my PhD on humor, actually. And,
okay.
yeah, I mean, that's for me interesting because, I mean, like in Nietzsche and like some of his likes, yeah, I mean, it's really rarely dealt with it. We have like Jean-Paul, we have like, strangely enough, Kierkegaard talking about humor, and then we have Nietzsche, yeah. So for me, it's like, I mean,
Bakhtin, I guess,
like,
right?
Sorry?
Bakhtin.
Yeah, and Bakhtin, yeah,
Yeah.
like more recently, and even Umberto Eco, you have some, yeah. The thing was that, I mean, like in my speech, I mean, there was a question that, or I have this hunch that, um, even to some extent, Nietzschean understanding of happiness was more ephemeral when it comes to happiness. I mean, vis-a-vis Hegel, that you have like a systematic progress, like, yeah, and even in Enlightenment, that you have this like uh, progress in history, this dialectic of happiness, yeah. So
Sure.
that was.
Okay, well, yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, Nietzsche is kind of contemptuous of happiness.
Mm,
He calls,
mm,
happiness something that the Englishman wants. He
mm,
sees it as a kind of bourgeois,
mm,
attainment,
mm,
comfort, right?
mm, mm,
And of course, Nietzsche, as you know, is after bigger fish, right? So
mm,
he embraces. Um, in some ways, he embraces the tragic view, and his view is precisely the one that you ascribe to the Greeks. Not coincidentally, of course, he's a Greek philologist by training, but the laughter and the rejoicing in the face of great suffering. I mean,
mm,
he has these
mm, mm,
many ways disturbing passages in the genealogy of morality, talking about the blonde beast celebrating after rampage and rape and pillage and so on and so forth. And obviously these are passages that later get appropriated and misinterpreted by the Nazis and others. But there's this acceptance in Nietzsche of suffering, and the recognition that um, that higher men in life will inevitably grapple with that suffering. That the point of a Napoleon is not to be happy; it's to do great things. And Nietzsche's interested in that. I think one um, can argue that he in some ways romanticizes that
mm, mm,
a little bit. There's something to be said for the happiness of the Englishman, frankly, but
mm.
um, but one sees his point.
Yeah.
One sees his
But do
point.
you still see this, I mean, traces of this romantic understanding of happiness? Like we have, this can be seen, for example, in Goethe's publication of The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Yeah,
The book became popular among young people who were discontented
yeah.
with their life. Yeah, and Goethe's work gained a following. People even dressed like Werther. And then you have like the poet Jean Paul introducing the concept of Weltschmerz, yeah, like the
Sure.
word suffering to express the inexplicable sadness and pain in this life. And then you have like Coleridge, I mean, other romantics. I mean,
Mm.
my question is, do you think we are now fully disconnected from this romantic idea of joy in today's understanding of happiness?
No, and I think intellectuals probably least of all.
Mm.
As I try to point out in the book, there is this romanticization of suffering, which has deep roots in the Christian tradition, certainly, in the Jewish tradition too, um, but then is built upon in various ways at various stages. And we could talk about this at length. This actually intersects with a topic of another book, Divine Fury, A History of Idea of Genius. And from very early on, you get an idea in pseudo-Aristotelian medical thought, and then in Platonic thinking, that great attainment, great genius, great artistic production is somehow linked to pathology or sickness or illness. And so there's this idea, this myth that, as I say, developed early on, and then it's kind of strengthened in the Renaissance and has given a kind of scientific veneer in the 19th century, that great minds, great thinkers suffer, right? They suffer disease, illness, pathology as a byproduct of their
Genius.
artistic production. The
Mm.
Romantics give that a spin of their own, and they're rejecting or reacting to, in some ways, what they see as a kind of facile Enlightenment endorsement of happiness. And you give the example of Werther. And he, as you say, sponsors or promotes imitations throughout Europe, and indeed some suicides on the model of Werther. And I think one does begin to see at the early part of the 19th century this idea that that suffering is more profound than happiness. That happiness is somehow simple. Bourgeois, maybe has, kind of has dangerous associations with the market and consumption and so forth. And that's a prejudice that endures. So, to give you an example close to home, when I was an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley, studying intellectual history and philosophy and literature, I wore black most of the time. I smoked incessantly. I assumed that if a book wasn't about death, it wasn't a good book. There was a kind of way in which I listened to like a lot of depressing music, the Smiths and Joy Division and The Cure and things like this, and cultivated as only a 21-year-old naive can, this idea that suffering was somehow deep and profound. And I'm making light of that, but I think that idea is still around, and it's often around intellectuals. And so, I mean, this is a whole nother subject, but I like to point out when I teach the history of happiness, or I teach ideas about happiness, that you can kind of go down the list of the disciplines, and point out a kind of prejudice against happiness until relatively recently. So I like to tell the story of my friend Ruud Veenhoven, who's a Dutch sociologist and really a pioneer in studying comparative happiness of peoples. He's the founder of the Journal of Happiness Studies, or one of them. And Root tells this great story where he was studying sociology in the Netherlands in the 1960s. And what are sociologists studying then? They're studying hegemony and oppression and class oppression and racism and all the negatives. And he told his advisor he wanted to study happiness, and his advisor looked him in the eye and said, never mention that word again, because you'll never get a job, right? And really, this is true in so many different fields, right? If you think about economics, the dismal science, even despite a kind of origins in the 18th and early 19th century in happiness, left that behind until relatively recently. It's true in psychology, right? Freud says in the studies of hysteria that the point of what he will later call psychoanalysis is to bring about ordinary
unhappiness.
empathy, right? That's the idea, that suffering is inevitable, and that one can remove unnecessary suffering, neurosis, but you can overcome the human condition. And so in field after field, including history, I mean, when I started studying the history of happiness, despite this really kind of centrality of the idea in in Western history, people sort of laughed at me. They didn't really know how to deal with it. It seemed strange to them. It seemed a little superficial and trite. And so I think that reflects in all these disciplines a kind of prejudice that intellectuals in particular feel vis-a-vis happiness. That, as I say, has changed. And I think if you look at it in a different way, then happiness or human flourishing becomes what it was for the Greeks and for many religious thinkers, the great question, right? How to live optimally in a world that that tries to thwart that.
There is another question. What is yet another interesting facet of your research is that there is a shift from the thought of enlightenment and their interpretation of happiness and the utopians, such as Saint Saint-Simon Fourier, who came afterwards. Quoting you, whereas enlightenment theories and their liberal successors tended to conceive of happiness in individual terms, the utopians regarded the community as a sole category in which discussions of happiness made sense. End of quote. Later on, you add that the utopians, socialists, argued that happiness must be extended to all. It was not enough, they maintained, merely to provide the conditions in which we are allowed to maximize personal pleasure. However, what makes it more interesting is that this inclination to define society based on its entirety rather than its parts is yet more accentuated in Marxism. It's interesting that one can hardly associate communism or Marxism with happiness, and yet you argue that there is a social commitment to happiness in communism. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right. Well, I mean, Marx famously says, right, that the overcoming of religion is the overcoming of false happiness, implying that that communism will provide a real happiness, right? And you mentioned Hegel before, and of course Hegel is an important thinker for Marx, and Hegel conceives of his philosophy as what he describes as a theodicy, an explanation of evil, and he describes human history as a slaughter bench upon which the happiness of peoples has been sacrificed. But there's the intimation that one is leading towards something better, right? That all this struggle will not have been for naught, that it will have a purpose and a resolution. And I think that idea is clearly there in Marx as well. And although Marx himself is hard-headed, there is at least the implication that the overcoming of illusory happiness, the opium of religion, will lead to a more real happiness. And, that when you're looking at this through the prism of the Gulag can seem a little strange, but I have these images in the book where clearly Stalin uses this rhetoric of the building of real happiness quite self-consciously, and other communist leaders do too. But that insight embedded at the heart of Marxism, that human beings need to recover their species being in Marxist terms, that they need to recover the sense that they are, as Aristotle said, right, social animals, and that their happiness is dependent upon their embeddedness in society. This is something that Aristotle knew well. I think this is a profound insight, and Marx is right about that. And that's something that Western societies have tended to forget. That pursuing happiness individually is often not a good strategy, that we're social creatures and we need others to enrich us.
Right. I mean, Darrin, there is a point that I hadn't written that just like sprang to my mind, and I really love to ask there. And there is just some few pages of the book where you talk about this masculine understanding and interpretation of happiness in terms of felicitas, felix. I mean, etymologically, you go to felicitas, penis, felix, and so on. To what extent do you think happiness, or what we perceive of happiness, is gendered or colored?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, I've been saying to people lately in the midst of our current upheavals that I woke up one day and I realized that I'm an old white guy. It's true. I wrote this book in the 80s, and I was interested in gender questions, but they weren't the central focus of the book. And some smart reviews have drawn attention to that. And I honestly think that I would do this again. I would spend much more time on the gender dynamics, although I'm happy to say that some really fine books have come out since that focus on precisely that question. Because I think it's clear that, like all things, happiness can be and has been gendered. Clearly, in the 19th century, notions of active male, virile pursuit of happiness, right? The French say "la chasse au bonheur," right? The hunt for happiness, and hunting is clearly a kind of masculine activity. For Aristotle himself, who describes human flourishing, or eudaimonia, as an activity lived in accordance with virtue, there's too this masculine active sense where feminine happiness is often skewed in a more passive way. So I think that at various points one can clearly say that that there's a gender dynamic to constructions of happiness, like really to constructions of many things. Whether or not there are different kind of physiologies of happiness, that I'm more doubtful about. And in fact, I don't know of a whole lot of work along those lines by positive psychologists. But I think in the discourses about happiness, as I say, like discourses about almost everything, one can look at a gender dynamic. And you put your finger on one important aspect of this way that happiness again and again gets described as a kind of activity and attainment. It's something that men go out and pursue and then provide to their children and to the household. This is clearly how Aristotle thought of it, and his thought is really the kind of basis of so much thinking going forward.
What should we do with these statistics that every year we receive about happiness? Like, how should we deal with the with the data on world happiness. For example, data such as 2/3 of adults globally, 64% report being happy, 13% very much, and 15% rather so. Countries with the highest proportion of adults considering themselves as very happy as Canada, 29%, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and India, 28%, Great Britain and United States. Or another statistics, Finland was ranked as the happiest country in the world according to the World Happiness Report from 2021. The Nordic countries scored 7.89 on a scale from 0 to 10. Two other Nordic countries, Iceland and Denmark, followed the second place respectively. How should we interpret these statistics?
Yeah. I've had this conversation many times with my friend and colleague Ed Diener, who's a great social scientist and psychologist who's organized for Gallup many of these polls over the years. He's quite ill now with cancer, unfortunately, but he comes at this questions as a social scientist, and I come at it as a historian. And I think, implied in your question is a little bit of skepticism about all this. And I think there are a number of things to say. And one is, as Darwin appreciated in the 19th century, human beings have to be happy enough on average to want to reproduce. And those of us who are alive today are product of, natural selection. And on the whole, we tend to be happy enough to want to get up in the morning. And of course, there are terrible exceptions to this. And this is not to make light of depression and the illnesses associated with it. But on the whole, most people are fairly happy, right? So that's one thing. Two, I think, people don't like to present themselves to others in a world that associates happiness with success as unhappy. I think this is this goes on in places like Denmark or Finland, which are often described as the happiest places on earth. And there are other factors that contribute to, I think, that that perception and maybe even reality. But one will hear Danes just say that, you wouldn't want to admit to a pollster that you were unhappy. So I think there's a kind of inflation that goes on here, but pollsters are pretty sophisticated in their statistics, and they take this into consideration. And they know, for example, that if you ask somebody on the telephone how happy they are, you'll get a different answer from if you ask them in person and whatnot. And they build all these variances in to their statistics. I think the question that one has to always pose to the skeptics in the face of this kind of data is, if you can't tell me how happy you are, who can? In other words, aren't you at the end of the day the best gauge and measure of your own happiness? And what we do know is that the answer that you would give me if I ask you, Madi, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Your answer will tend to correlate very closely with the answer that your best friend or partner or family members will give. In other words, people are actually a pretty good judge at the end of the day of how happy they are. And I think that when one looks at these figures on the macro level, it's not all that surprising that Finland or Denmark or Norway have high happiness scores. Why? Well, they have great social tolerance, and this turns out to be really important. Human beings like to have a sense of agency. They like to be able to dictate their lives for themselves. And intolerant societies or repressive societies that don't allow people to live they want to be, the way they want to live, with whom they want to live, and think the way they want to think, tend to militate against happiness. They have high social tolerance. They're wealthy. Wealth, we know, matters, and matters a great deal. They have democracy, and again, this goes with the sense of agency. They have very high social capital, which is, say, little corruption. They have a number of features and factors that we can show correlate high with happiness. They have great healthcare systems, social safety nets, sense of security, and so on and so forth. So although one always wants to take these macro assessments of the happiness of the world with a certain grain of salt, I think when you look at the figures for the globe, they make a certain degree of sense, and there's a certain traction.
Right. So I want to end this brilliant conversation with a quote from you, and if you want to add in some comment to this quote from the book, you're more than welcome. You say that it's not relatively recently that human beings have begun to think of happiness as not just an earthly possibility, but also in some ways as an obligation or entitlement, a natural human right. I think this has created a new and very modern pressure, even a new type of unhappiness, the unhappiness of not being happy.
Yeah. Right. And we talked about this before. I have a colleague in France, philosopher Pascal Bruckner, who talks about the duty to be happy in the modern world as a kind of obligation and onus. And I think, the pursuit of happiness can become that. And the response in the face of that is to simply to do other things. This has been my own strategy. I sometimes ask, what did you learn after studying happiness for a decade? And the first thing I say is, I'm a historian. I don't have answers, right? If I had answers, I'd probably be advising the United Nations or something. And if anyone tells you they have the answer, the secret to happiness, you should run away because they're probably trying to sell you something. But if I did gain an insight from all the work, it's precisely that focusing on happiness exclusively is a little bit like lying in bed at night and telling yourself you have to go to sleep. And as we know, that doesn't work out very well. I have to go to sleep. I have to go to sleep. I have to go to sleep. I have a big important meeting tomorrow. The better way to go to sleep is to let go and think about something else. And what I learned is that, maybe the best way to pursue happiness is to pursue it indirectly by doing other things, by cultivating your passions, by spending time with people you care for, by contributing your time to causes that you care about, and you may just find that brings happiness without even thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful, Darrin. Yeah, I really
So
enjoyed it.
much fun to talk to you.
Yeah, it was a big pleasure talking to you.